Hello everybody, and welcome to our presentation today entitled Graduate Study in Psychology and Psychology-Related Fields. My name is Allison Butler.
Joe Trunzo.
Amy Weinstein.
And Ron DeLuga.
And we're really glad you all came here today. We have a couple of handouts that you can pick up at the end on your way out. One of them is a nice article from Psychology Today about careers in psychology and which degrees align with which careers. This is a handout about the psychology concentration and what the requirements are. This is last year's BPA newsletter, and this is from the Anika Center, a whole list of resources of online sites that could be helpful to you when you're considering a graduate study in psychology. We had thought that maybe a useful way to start the presentation was to just go down the line here and mention to you in just 2 or 3 sentences what our pathway was to getting this wonderful opportunity to be working here at Bryant right now. So from undergrad to now, what's happened? Okay, so I was an undergrad psychology and education double major, and from there I got a job teaching 5th grade right out of school. Did that picture come out good? Okay. So I did that right out of school, and then just shortly after starting teaching, I felt like I needed a break from undergrad, but I knew I wanted to go to grad school. I just didn't know how long I should wait before going back, and some of you might be in that place. Do you apply right out of the gates? Do you work first, then go back? So what I did was take a couple of courses before I actually applied, which allowed me to kind of dip my feet into a master's program without actually committing and applying yet. When I liked those 2 courses, I transferred them in, started the program, applied, and so forth. And so that was an MED program in educational psychology that I did nights, summers, and weekends while I was an elementary school teacher. After finishing that, then I did my Ph.D. in applied developmental and educational psychology at BC, and then I came here.
I was an undergraduate psychology major with the, I think I was in the clinical track, but I went degrees in BS. And I knew going right into undergrad that I wanted to go to graduate school and I wanted to get a Ph.D. in clinical psychology. So I was very sort of driven and goal-directed in that regard. At the end of my senior year, or in my senior year, I applied for a bunch of clinical PhD programs, got rejected to all of them. The following year, so I worked for a year, the following year I applied to a bunch of clinical PhD programs and got rejected from all of them. I got waitlisted a couple places my second year, the second year I applied, and I got accepted to a master's degree program, which I chose not to attend because I knew that I think I had the sense that I was getting close, and I knew that I didn't want to go get a master's degree and then have to go into a PhD program, although that's not necessarily a bad path to go, as we'll talk about. And then the third year, when I became much more focused in terms of what I wanted to do my research on, hit the jackpot and got into a clinical PhD program, did that for 5 years, got my degree, did a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship, and got licensed in.
Voila.
So my path also starts as an undergrad psychology major. I knew I didn't want to go to grad school right away. In fact, I was pretty sure I didn't. I was pretty sure I wanted to go into a business profession. I actually looked at human resources and a variety of different career paths. Basically, I think I really didn't know really what I wanted to do at all. So that's where I was, and I moved to California. That was my solution to finding a job, and kind of did a variety of different jobs working with students. And one of my entry-level jobs was actually working for the Fulbright program, administering scholarships for international Fulbright students who were here, and I got to travel to a lot of different college campuses, and it was kind of a fun job. And then I sort of started to get on a path thinking that was an area I'd like to go into. Ended up with a master's in counseling with a track towards career counseling, and had a variety of internships and continued to get more focused in that area, and have not left that path since. So here I am today.
We're learning a lot about these people. I think a few key points is a lot of us had no idea what we were going to do, especially when we were in school. In my case, I went to Bowling Green State University in Ohio, and I majored in biology. And I had a minor in psychology. After I graduated from there, I went to a graduate school directly at Miami University in Ohio as well. When I was at Bowling Green, a very important part of my experience was being an RA, not only for being an RA for 3 years and living with freshmen, but of course the financial aspect of that, paying for my amount to my room and board there, but also enabled me to be RD at Miami University, which paid for everything plus a $15,000 stipend or whatever it was at the time there. So I had my master's degree in constantly paid for at Miami University. At which point, as I said, I was an RD, and I noticed in the dorm next to me there was a cute girl who was an RD there, and I ended up marrying her. So got married in the campus chapel there. That was in the Cincinnati area, and we moved to Cincinnati after being married, and I lived with students for 8 consecutive years. The last year I was married with all males. And I worked at a law school at Northern Kentucky University as a counselor to the law school students. I was there for 4 years or 5 years, I guess it was, and in the meantime, kind of like an aside, I got my doctorate, mostly going to school at night and on weekends, as well as an MBA going to school at night and weekends. So I had like 2 lives, my work life and my academic life, and no personal life. But that was okay, it was well worth it. And I applied, I had no idea what I was going to do in terms of my career. I could have gone the business route, I guess. I could have gone like the college administration route. I remember interviewing for jobs as a director of career services at various schools. But this opportunity arose here at Bryant University in 1981, and I've been here ever since. So that's how I got here.
Thank you. Thanks,
I
everybody.
could have been working for you.
And so the format for the rest is we got together a few times. We talked about what we thought were maybe some themes. It's impossible to cover everything in 1 hour. So our goal is just to whet your appetite for some of these deeper conversations that you could have with the Amica Center, with any one of us in the Department of Applied Psychology, with your academic advisor. Come see us. We're expecting and hoping that you'll come knock on our doors and ask to have a deeper conversation about your particular goals and what you're trying to accomplish. All right, these seem a little bit cynical, but I'm really into Google imaging different topics when I have a PowerPoint presentation. So when I Googled grad school images, none of them were so positive, but don't worry, because we're gonna put a positive spin on all of this in just a minute. Here's a funny one. Should you go to grad school? True, false? I'm a compulsive neurotic. If you put true. I like my imagination crushed into dust. Yikes. I enjoy being a professor's slave. My idea, I kind of like this one, my idea of a good time is using jargon and citing authorities. APA style, of course. I feel a deep need to continue the process of avoiding life. Anyway, this is just a joke. Then I saw that one, and that could have been a self-portrait of Allison Jill Fuso Butler at one point earlier on, yeah. And then down here, the grad student brain, if you have a Freud sense of humor and appreciate your id, ego, superego, and the super duper ego, you can take a look at some of that, might give you a chuckle. We do have handouts of these that we'll pass out at the end, and some of these slides have links in them, so we're gonna get your email and send these all out to you guys so that you have these slides, so you don't have to worry too much about writing down every detail. So what are we gonna talk about today? The first topic is going to be how do you actually make the decision whether it's a good point in your life to apply to graduate school? How do you decide if that's the next step for you? Understanding the vast array of degrees in psychology that are out there. Clinical degrees, non-clinical degrees, doctorates, master's degrees, many different types, and we're going to try to survey for you, which I think is one of the exciting parts, is to understand how rich this field is and to see, as a psychology major or minor, so many pathways that you could take in graduate study. There's not 1 or 2 choices, there's a vast array. Professor Tronzo is going to talk more in detail about understanding the clinical world, things like when should it be social work or mental health counseling or clinical psych, for example. And then we'll be talking about how you actually decide where to apply. How do you generate your list? You know you want to go. How do you actually choose where to send your application to? And then the application process. What are the nuts and bolts? What are the steps? What do you need to accomplish? Both what should you do to prepare in your undergrad years and how do you do it when you're actually applying? A little bit about the nuts and bolts of the GRE. And we'll have a little discussion about financing grad school. Show me the money. All right?
Okay, so obviously the first thing you have to do is you have to figure out whether or not grad school is right for you and whether or not you want to apply and whether or not you want to go. So the important thing to understand is that you don't have to make the decision about going to graduate school until you have an offer, right? right? So you don't have to decide grad school or job. You can apply for jobs and you can apply for grad school and then make your decision once you know what options are available to you and what's on the table. So everybody panics because it's like you feel like you have to make the either or decision, somewhere between your junior and senior year, and that's not necessarily the case. So you can take both pathways, but I wanted to break this down in the context of, I sort of did some do's and don'ts. So what should you base your decision on and what shouldn't you base your decision on? So first, the not. Do not base your decision on fear or anxiety about the future. So if you're just like, I have no idea what I'm going to do, I'm scared to death, I don't have a job, I'm just going to apply to graduate school just so I have something to do. Big mistake, okay? The overarching theme that you'll hear from everybody up here today is that grad school is a commitment. It's not only a financial commitment, but it is a time commitment, it's an emotional commitment, and you shouldn't be doing it out of avoiding something else or out of fear of something else. It should be something that you genuinely want to do and you have a passion about. We'll get to the shows in a second. So fear or anxiety about your future. Avoidance, which goes hand in hand with fear or anxiety. If we're scared of something, we want to get away from it. So if you're scared of life and you want to avoid life by going to graduate school, which a lot of people do, you can do that, but it's probably not going to turn out very well for you because if you're doing something out of avoidance, that usually doesn't end up very well. Don't do it out of expectations of other people. Like if you come from a family where every single person in your family has an advanced degree and it's just sort of expected that you should have one, also not a good reason, right? That can be a really hard thing to sort of to rebel against, but if you don't have a fairly clear vision of what you want to do and what kind of grad that you definitely want to further your education, you shouldn't do it just because other people expect you to. That probably will not turn out well either. Don't do it out of lack of options. I don't have anything else to do. I can't find a job, so I'm just going to apply to grad school and go because that way, like, I'm doing something. Again, that's not a good reason to make a decision. You should be thinking about more along the lines of what do you want to do, not this is what I have left, or this is my only choice, or this is my only option. Don't make the decision based on finances or lack thereof. So, if you're fortunate enough to have the money to go to graduate school, don't just say, well, hey, I've got the money, why not? That's the more unusual of the two circumstances, I would say. But you can also say, well, I don't have any money, so I'll just take out a bunch of student loans and go to graduate school. Also not a good reason to go. Don't do it out of a desire to extend the party, so to speak, so put that in quotes. Undergrad is fun, right? You're living in your dormitory environment, you have a lot of friends, and there's you're learning stuff, but you're having fun, you're partying, all that sort of thing. Graduate school is a very, very different animal. Okay, most of the people you're going to run into are a lot more serious about their work than a lot of the people your friends at school and at the university. And most of the people are doing other stuff as well. You might be in a program where it's full-time study, but you might be in a program where it's part-time study, and you're working and going to school, or everybody's working and going to school, and it's just there's a lot less sort of like communal time in grad school than there is in college. So it's not, you shouldn't do it because you want to avoid the rest of your life. You shouldn't do it because you say, wow, undergrad was really fun, time of my life kind of thing. I don't really want to face the real world, so I'll just go to graduate school and just kind of keep that. You don't want to have sort of like the professional student. That's not going to be very useful either. Any questions about any of those? Okay. That worked. Okay. So do make your decision based on genuine passion, joy, and interest for the field of study. I listed that 3 times on purpose because to my point of view, this should be your main deciding factor for whether or not you want to go to graduate school. You should genuinely enjoy the material and the subject matter that you plan on studying. Because, like we said, graduate school is a commitment. It takes time, it takes money, it's an investment of your life. You are delaying, particularly if you're in a doctoral program. You're going to be in school for 4 or 5 years while all of your friends are out making money and saving, putting money away for retirement, and buying houses and all that kind of stuff. And you're probably not going to be in that situation. So to some extent, you're delaying your life for X period of time. And if you're going to make that commitment, it absolutely has to be for something that you really love and that you really enjoy doing. I tell this to my advisees all the time, particularly for doctoral programs. If you go to a doctoral program, you don't really want to be there, the program will chew you up and spit you out. The level of work that's involved in what you have to do and the impact that it has on your life, if you don't have a genuine passion and joy for what you're doing, you're not going to be happy about the sacrifices that you have to make to follow through and make that commitment. So I listed that 3 times. If I could have listed it 6, I would have, but I had other stuff I needed to say. So an obvious necessity to meet your overall goal. So you have to think about what it is you want to do. So if like you say to yourself, geez, I'd really like to be a counselor, I'd really like to help people and be some kind of clinician. Well, you're probably not going to be able to do that successfully if you don't have an advanced degree, either a master's degree or a doctoral degree. I mean, technically, after your bachelor's, but technically now, any of you could go out and hang out a shingle and call yourself anything other than a psychologist. And if people are stupid enough to come and pay you for you to advise them on how to live their lives, that's great, but there's not an insurance company on the planet that's going to reimburse you or them for your services, right? You could be a life coach, right? There's no laws about that. But if you want to be a licensed clinical psychologist or counseling psychologist, you need a doctoral degree. It's not the only path for doing clinical work, as I'll talk about later. But if you know I want to do X and X requires that I have an advanced degree, that's a good reason for you to go and get the advanced degree. Okay, so that's one reason. That's another reason to go. So timing in your life, family or relationship plans, etc. These are things that you have to consider. So if you're in a relationship, if you're thinking about when you might want to get married, when you want to start a family, when you want to have kids, do you want to do graduate school before then? Do you want to establish some of those things and then go back? These are all important considerations that you should think about and you should have. I will say that it's not uncommon for people to be in graduate school while they have families. I went to grad school with people who had kids, young kids, old kids, women who gave birth while they were in graduate school. Allison, went through it. So it's possible. I think most people would say it's a lot more complicated. And I got married when I was in grad school, but I didn't have my kids until after I got a job. So, and when I think back, I'm kind of glad that it happened that way, okay? But it is possible to mix the professional and personal when you're doing graduate school. You just need to think about what the right decision is for you in terms of the timing.
I got a puppy when I was in graduate school.
And I had a biological clock. Keeping it real.
I don't know how you did it with any of those things,
Yeah.
a puppy or a kid. I didn't know any.
So a willingness to undertake the commitment. So as I mentioned, graduate school, in whether it's a master's degree or a doctoral degree, it requires a commitment. It requires a commitment of time, energy, money, all of those things. And you have to be willing to do that. And if you're not, the chances are you're not going to be very successful because you have to put a lot into it. The academic rigor is harder, you do a lot more reading, your papers are longer, the expectations are higher, so everything sort of gets raised a level, and you have to juggle that with the rest of your life and doing all those sorts of things. So you have to understand what the commitment that's involved and be willing to undertake that in order to make the decision to go. And then lastly, career prospects or finances, and I have in parentheses, although less so. So you have to think about what career options you're going to have with the degree that you're going to get, and how much money you're likely to make, assuming you get a job after your graduate degree. If I told you that graduate school is going to cost you $100,000 and you're going to get a job that pays you $25,000 a year when you're done, I would probably advise you against pursuing that graduate degree. So you should think about those things. I mean, most psychologists are in the helping professions, and you probably don't make as much as people in business, but you can still do well, very well, with a degree in psychology. I'm quite happy. Okay, and graduate school cost me an arm and a leg, but you should at least have that as part of your calculus for the decisions that you make about whether or not to go. And we'll talk more about that in financing. I'll talk more about that in clinical stuff. Any questions about any of that? Okay, then I'm passing the mantle.
I think this way.
This way.
Yep,
Sorry.
thank you. No problem. All right, so now for the next few slides here, we're going to get into what I would consider one of the really most fun parts of this, which is really understanding the vast array of options that are out there for you to pursue graduate study. So we've sort of divided this up a little bit into non-clinical routes, clinical routes, master's level, doctorate level. So a non-clinical master's degree. Can someone say what I mean by non-clinical, even just so we are all clear on that? What do I mean by that distinction between non-clinical and clinical?
Yes, it's a good thing we're making.
It's really good we're having this presentation. Would one of you like to explain? Maybe Joe, would you tell us?
So the clinical path or a clinical degree in psychology puts you in a position where you are providing clinical services. In other words, you're counseling or advising or treating people who have mental illnesses or mental disorders or life problems or those sorts of things. And most people, when they think of psychology, that's instantly what they think of. They think of a shrink coming in, laying down on somebody's couch and doing all of that kind of stuff. And there are lots of different ways to pursue clinical degrees, but in psychology, that is but one faction of the different paths that you can take in terms of the advanced degree of psychology. So everything else that's not clinical is non-clinical.
Right.
Which is what Allison is.
And it was maybe by way of example, just because it's my area, there's a really big difference between an educational psychologist and a school psychologist. Which one's clinical? Everybody. An educational psychologist and a school psychologist. One of those is clinical and one is not.
School.
Which one's clinical, everybody?
School.
School. Thank you. You get an A.
Yeah.
The school psychologist is someone who's going to go in, maybe do some cognitive testing, learning assessments, work with students who have learning disabilities, meet with their family, meet with the teachers. That's not what an educational psychologist would do. An educational psychologist could end up working in student affairs in higher ed. They could end up going back to grad school. That's what my master's degree is in, and I've never done any cognitive testing in schools with students with learning disabilities. The names might sound similar, but they're drastically different in terms of what they lead you to. Okay, back to the general stuff. A non-clinical master's degree, you can anticipate that taking 12 months to 2 years, approximately, if you're going full-time. A lot of people do it part-time. Mine was like 2.5 years, and I did it while I was teaching 5th grade. Often it culminates with a master's thesis, not to be confused with a dissertation. It's smaller in scope, but these are program-specific, but it's usually some culminating independent research project that you do. You might have a Master of Science or a Master of Arts. A lot of the psychology ones that I was reading up on typically seem to be more maybe in the Master of Science category. Some of these examples, so you can look at this list and think of the things that sort of tickle your fancy. There are general psych master's degrees. They do exist. I think most of us might suggest that they don't lead you to a goal as well as something a little bit more specific, but they do exist. Cognitive psych, different than biopsych or neuropsych. Developmental psych. Within developmental psych, you might have a lifespan development master's degree, or you might have an adult development master's, or you might have a child development, you might have early childhood. So these can all vary depending on how the schools list them. Forensic psych, industrial organizational psych, social, educational, personality, sports, health, environmental. Quantitative psych would be someone who's really focused on research methods used in psychology. Community psych, so kind of risk and prevention work and working within the communities, often at-risk communities. And experimental psych that may involve a lot of animal studies, for example, among other things. I wanted to pull out, because this is sort of a complementary area and also my area, that there is a subset of these degrees that are psychology, education, kind of interwoven together. There's a distinction between an MAT and an MED. If you want to come out of an undergrad institution that didn't offer you licensing opportunities, so if you want to be a public school teacher, you need to have your credentials, your license, or your certificate in a particular age group, middle school or high school, for example. And if you went to a program that didn't have an undergrad licensing program, the MAT would be the single most efficient way for you to get those credentials so that you could make it into the classroom. The MED is more general. It usually takes a little bit longer. It has more of a research base. This, in my mind, is similar to the difference between a Psy.D and a Ph.D. More on that to come. The MAT is the practitioner's degree for a teacher. The MED is more of a general degree. So if you were someone that you said, I'm generally interested in the education field, and you came to my office, I would suggest that you get an MED, because that often will lead you to your teaching credentials, but then you often can then spin that in multiple ways to apply to a doctoral program later, for example.
Do you want, I don't know if you did or not. Do you want to tell them what the initials mean?
Sure, thank you. MAT is a Master of Arts in Teaching versus a Master of Education. Yes?
Allison, maybe I'm not clear.
Yeah.
I always thought of an MAT for people who want to do secondary ed rather than, now it's for.
Yeah, you could have an
elementary as well?
MET in elementary ed. The one we offer at Bryant that just launched this year is the 5-year secondary ed MET.
So even people in special ed are getting MAT rather than MAD now?
In special ed, it varies. In elementary ed, there's definitely an MAT.
Can they
Special
do
ed
both
is
in-
often an MED.
Okay, don't they do both in elementary or?
Yep, you
Yeah.
might see an MAT in elementary ed, or you might see an MED in elementary ed.
Yeah, what I'm saying is kind of the course, like some people in history might want to teach history in high school, and that, it's always been the MAT.
Yep.
Or science or something, okay.
Yeah, I think the quickest way is to say, if your goal is to get into the classroom quickly, and you're pretty sure that that's where you're gonna stay for a long number of years, you should definitely do an MAT. It'll be quick, it'll be efficient, it'll get you the coursework you need. The MAD is more of a typical graduate student experience, I would say, in terms of the research. All of these things are related to psychology in some way, especially if you're someone who likes child development or you liked ed psych. I think an overlooked area, personally, when I talk to students, is the world of jobs that are available in higher ed. I think there's a lot of really fun psych meets education types of jobs, whether it's student affairs, college student development, kind of work that Amy does, and people don't kind of think of it because you're college students, so it may not be something that occurs to you. But I won't go through the whole list there, but just to pull out a few, like if you really like learning theories, it might make sense for you to get a master's degree in curriculum and instruction, and that might lead you to be a curriculum coordinator for an entire school district. You're not in the classroom, you're not a teacher, you're not a principal. There's kind of a whole world of different paths that you can take. Why would someone get a non-clinical master's degree, whether it's from this education category or the MA, MS category on the previous slide? Sometimes it is a stepping stone to a PhD. It's a 2-year commitment versus a 5-year commitment. So on a commitment level, it makes sense to do that. Another reason is it can make you more of a competitive applicant to get into that doctoral program. So a lot of times it makes sense to do that. So if you can get yourself a really fabulous master's degree from a top-notch institution, that can make all the difference in getting you into that doctoral program. So maybe when I tell students a lot of times when they're applying straight out of undergrad from Bryant, and they say, I want to get my PhD, I want to get my PhD. I don't discourage them from applying to those programs, but similar to what others have said, cast a wide net. If you're a really excellent student, apply to some stellar master's programs at fabulous schools so that if you have to stall and you don't get into the PhD program right away, this gives you the benefit of getting your feet wet and you're still taking on a pretty big commitment. But there's a big difference between 5 years and a dissertation and 12 months if you do it full time and you can still get the experience. In addition, sometimes that's the qualification you need to get the particular job, and they are certainly endpoints on their own. You want to be a researcher. If you want to be a teacher, you want to be an employee in a particular organization or a school or a university. Sometimes these are the degrees. And this is just occurring to me right now, but if you know what job you want to do and you're not sure what degree goes with that job, go onto an employer's website or an organizational website and look at the staff directories and at the bios, and they will tell you what degrees those people have, right? You could go into our department and see, Ron has an EDD, I have a PhD. There's differences there, so that tells you that that degree can get you into that particular niche. So you can work backwards, choose the job or the organization, and then work backwards. So the PhD, my personal opinion is some of the scary stuff that we say about it's hard, it's a lot of years, it's a lot of money. In a lot of cases, in my opinion, we're talking about the doctoral program. I can say that from my experience because my master's program wasn't actually that scary. It wasn't that bad, actually, but there's variability there. Here you're looking at a 4 to 6 year commitment. I did get married after year 2, and then I had a baby in year 4, which was like the dissertation year. And it all worked out. I wanted to have a couple years under my belt here, popped out that second baby, and here we are applying for tenure. Check, 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 check. Right, life plan underway. I set this life plan in Borders with my girlfriends one day when I was in like 6th grade. Kind of a planner. I don't know, someone should come and mess something up for me so I can see how inflexible I am when the plans don't go so well. Something that's really fun with the doctoral degree is that you, in addition to your coursework, you're not just doing courses. Often you are doing independent research projects that are self-directed, including the dissertation, and sometimes you have TA experiences, or in my case, I was even able to not be a TA, but teach undergrads at Boston College while I was doing that degree. I taught many, many classes of students that gave me a lot of experience that helped me hone my desire to work in higher ed ultimately as a professor. There's a mentorship model in PhD programs, so interestingly, your often paired up with one particular professor that will be your mentor throughout. Sometimes that person will become your dissertation chair. So sometimes I would advise a student who was applying to a PhD program to even contact one of these professors in advance. So you say, the reason I want to apply to this school is I want to work with Professor Jan Smith. So we might look up Jan Smith's work, we might read some of Jan Smith's articles, and then we might craft a little email to Professor Jan Smith and say, I've put an application in, I'm really excited about your work. And then Jan Smith says, oh, admissions, I want to work with this student because they're interested in my stuff, I like what they have to offer, and that's a very unique thing. You wouldn't do that, applying to undergrad, but in PhD programs that's fairly common, I would say. Different from a master's degree, they're often smaller. My class at BC when I came into that doctoral program was 2. Luckily we got along well. My friend Holly and I were BFFs right now, that was lucky. But sometimes the classes are 5, 7, 8, small groups. Commitment level we've talked about, you're more self-directed. No one will make you finish that dissertation. They give you a ridiculously long number of years to finish it before they officially say, look buddy, the dream is over, get out of here. Ridiculous. I mean, it's not like you got 5 years or, no one's really doing much. I mean, your funding might go away, different things happen. I saw people drop by the wayside in my program, I'm sure we all did, because stuff happens. These years are really important years. Like your partner or your spouse has career things, they might need a geographic move, babies are born, things go on and you can get derailed. So that self-direction and kind of being able to do it is really important. Why would you get a non-clinical PhD? To do what we're doing, to do a lot of what we're doing. I knew I wanted to become a professor. I didn't know that when I was in your stage, but when I was teaching elementary school, I decided I thought it would be really cool to learn much more about how kids learn, because I thought teachers could be better teachers if they really understood how kids learn. Not just because they like biology and they want to talk about it, but that they understood the mechanisms behind learning. So that's what got me there, that passion that Joe was talking about, Professor Tronzo, and also it was an end goal situation. There were some rough days, and Professor Lacey and I have had some fun coffees talking about, oh no, my year was worse than yours. My second year, oh my God, that was the worst, right? And ultimately it's end goal. You got to do it to get the degree to be able to do this, which we all love.
All right, so
Can I just add
Of course.
one more thing?
Of course.
And this didn't come up, but the MSW, I don't know if you want to say a word about that? Is that
It comes up
coming?
in the clinical.
Okay, perfect. Sorry.
no, it's okay. And just to highlight and dovetail from what Professor Butler was talking about, there are 6 core full-time faculty members here in the psychology department at Bryant University. Does anybody know how many of them are licensed clinical psychologists? We're looking at it, okay? So the idea that if you're going to get a graduate degree in psychology, it has to be clinically oriented is, it's ridiculous, okay? Many people do, and that's the way but you don't have to, people think if you're getting an advanced degree in psychology that you're going to be doing counseling, and it is absolutely not the case. There is a very, very broad range of things that, directions that you can go. That being said, a lot of people are interested in doing clinical work. So, what are the options that are available to you? What do you need to do, and how do you get there? So that's what I'm going to talk about for the next couple of minutes. So one of the biggest questions that I get is, what's the difference between a clinical degree and a counseling degree? And it's somewhat nuanced, okay? Because a lot of counseling doctoral programs are actually very, what we would call clinically oriented, and some are a little less so. So the way you should think about this is if you're thinking of a clinical degree, you're probably going to be learning about how to deal with real psychopathology. Okay, so the stuff you learn about in abnormal psych, depression, anxiety, personality disorders, those kinds of things. Those are the things that clinical psychologists typically sink their teeth into and what they end up focusing on. Counseling psychologists focus more on things like job training, helping people to sort of like guide them and advise them in their lives. And you're like, I'm feeling, you can feel like you can need some therapy and help some direction and guidance in your life. That doesn't necessarily mean you have a diagnosable mental illness. So counseling psychologists often work in university counseling centers, career counseling centers, those sorts of things. And then if a more significant kind of pathology comes up that they're not particularly trained to handle, although many counseling psychologists are trained to handle those things, it just depends on their experience, then they might kick it over to a clinical psychologist. But if you're going for a clinical degree versus a counseling degree, think more about dealing with people who have really solid, pre-entrenched, diagnosable mental illness. Okay, so that's largely the difference. Does that sound right to you, Ron?
Yeah, the way I like to describe it is clinical psychology is helping abnormal people with abnormal problems, and counseling psychology is helping normal people with normal problems of life.
He should have done this part.
And yet I will add that, and again, I did my graduate work in California, and I think that's a whole other universe sometimes, but there's a huge faction of master's counseling folks with certifications, which is an exam that they pass at the end of their degree that certifies them to be a practicing private practice therapist, basically, in the state of California, and there's a whole host of those people floating around out there with master's degrees, so.
And I might add, that's might be a trend. I mean, we're seeing that in Massachusetts
Oh, yeah.
as well.
Yeah.
So, and my guess is that it might be more of that. I'm not.
I'm going to talk about that. So there's the idea that you have to get a doctoral degree in order to provide counseling services is patently false. There are many, many, many different paths that you can pursue to end up doing clinical work that do not involve getting a doctoral degree. If you have your heart set on being a licensed psychologist, calling yourself a psychologist and being licensed to practice psychology in whatever state you end up living in most states, you have to get a doctoral degree in psychology. Counseling, clinical doesn't typically matter. Ph.D., Psy.D. also doesn't matter. But if you want to call yourself a psychologist and you want to practice psychology, most state laws require that you have a doctoral degree. However, there are many, many other degrees that you can get that allow you to perform counseling services. You just can't call yourself a psychologist. Okay? And you get paid, right? You know, insurance companies reimburse you. It's all legit. It's all legal, and you're doing the same kinds of things that you would be doing if you had a doctoral degree. You might get paid a little bit less, but you're also not going to school for 100 years, right? So we'll get to those things in a second. So the different degrees you have, I don't know, you know, the BA versus the BS. The A and the S is basically the difference between art and science. So a BA and a BS. If you're looking at a BS or an MS, they're typically a little bit more research focused, and you might have to do like an original research project or like an honors thesis or a master's thesis. And when it comes down to doing clinical work, there's not a whole lot of difference between those two degrees. Okay, so I have a BS, and then my clinical program, my clinical doctorate program gave me an MA after my second year, and then I ended up with a PhD. So whether it's an MA or an MS has had absolutely no impact whatsoever on my overall career. Okay, where that tends to matter more is at the doctoral level, the difference between the PhD and the Psy.D. Does anybody know the difference? Some people should, because I talk about this in my classes, so I'd like somebody to know. What's the difference?
I think the PhD is more research oriented, right? So it's a little bit more intensive, and you need to do self-directed research, I believe.
You're exactly right.
I
And the
didn't take
Psy.D.
the
is
class.
what? The Psy.D. The best way to think about this is a PhD in clinical or counseling psychology. You are being trained to conduct both research and clinical work. Those programs are typically 5 years. The Psy.D. is what's known as a practitioner's degree. So you'll learn about research, but the research training will not be nearly as intensive as the PhD. So to get a PhD, you have to do a doctoral dissertation where you do an original research project, you sit in front of 5 other psychologists, and they try to crush you into oblivion, and hopefully you survive, and if you do, you walk out of the room Dr. So-and-so, okay? Assuming you've met all the other qualifications. The Psy.D. you typically have like a final year project, which can basically be like a really long, intensive research paper, but it's not necessarily at the level of a clinical PhD. So the Psy.D., most Psy.D. programs, which stands for Doctor of Psychology, they're practitioner's degree. It's like an MD in medicine. You can have a PhD in medicine, which means you're a medical researcher, or you can have an MD in medicine, which means you're a medical practitioner. So the Psy.D., if you have no interest in doing research, you don't want to be a professor, you don't want to teach, and unless it's in another Psy.D program, and you just want to get out there and do clinical work, the Psy.D is a good option for you. And that typically is 4 years instead of 5, because you're lopping off the last year of research. And the research and the clinical work is integrated all through those programs. You guys have all heard tale of how brutally difficult and statistically difficult it is to get into clinical Ph.D. programs. Those are the clinical Ph.D. programs. Those are the funded clinical Ph.D. programs where they have like 3, 4, 5 slots per year, and you get 2, 3, 4, 600 applications per year. They're ridiculously competitive. The Psy.D. programs, less so. Okay. So I have one here: the scientist versus the practitioner. In most clinical PhD programs, you'll be trained under what's known as the Boulder model. Okay, Boulder because it was named after, they had a meeting in Boulder, Colorado, where they came up, this is how we want to train clinical psychologists. And it's basically what the scientist practitioner. You're being trained as a scientist and a researcher. You are also being trained as a practitioner. So it gives you the option when you graduate, oh, I want to go into research. Oh, I want to teach. Oh, I want to do clinical work, or I want to do all of those things. It gives you sort of the most flexibility with your degree, but it's also the hardest one to pursue. Okay? The Psy.D operates under what's called the Vail model. We have all of our conferences in Colorado, I guess. I don't know why. But this is what's known as the scholar practitioner model, where you're trained mostly in the practice of psychology and the administration of clinical services, and you have some training in terms of how to read, interpret, and understand research, but you're not necessarily trained as to how to conduct research. Okay? So it's a little bit less intense in the research area, but just as, and sometimes more intense than in the clinical area. Okay? Is everybody clear on those differences? Any questions? Okay, good. So the other big distinction that we need to make are the differences between what are called professional schools versus traditional universities. So traditional universities are the schools that you've all heard of. Okay, these are your, they have a large undergraduate population. Bryant is a traditional university. The University of Pennsylvania, all the colleges and universities that have football teams and all that kind of stuff that you're familiar with. Those are traditional universities that have large undergraduate populations that support graduate study. Okay, they are typically better funded. And you would go in as a graduate student in psychology, and there are graduate students doing all different kinds of things in all different kinds of fields in those colleges and universities. Professional schools are schools that exist solely for the purpose of providing someone with a graduate degree in psychology. Okay, and some of the differences are in professional schools there is almost never funding. Okay, so they don't have an undergraduate university population to provide, to be able to pay people who are teaching assistants to fund people through their graduate study. Professional schools usually make you pay, however many thousands of dollars a year to attend. So that usually involves taking out student loans and so on and so forth. Professional schools also don't really have much of a campus. Okay, I interviewed at a professional school in California, and it was the floor of an office building. Like that was the campus. And they usually have deals with other colleges and universities in the area to use their library and stuff like that. But it's just, it's literally just a place where you go and learn about what you're doing, and then you have clinical placements outside and all of that kind of stuff. The other big difference is the number of degrees that are granted. In traditional universities, most places will take anywhere between 5, maybe as many as 10 or 20 students per class. In professional schools, they'll take 50 to 100. So those schools are graduating 50 to 100 psychologists, whereas the traditional universities are graduating 10, 15, maybe 20 at the most. Okay. So some people refer to professional schools as degree mills. I think that's a harsh characterization. Professional schools, some of the advantages are they're a lot easier to get into. So, they provide you with the opportunity to get a graduate education and a path to licensure and being able to do clinical work and all those sorts of things. So that helps. And, I've met people who have gone to professional schools who are really, really fantastic at what they do. It just depends on the program that you're going to. Just like there are good traditional university programs and bad traditional university programs, there are good professional school programs and bad professional school programs. So you have to be very sort of mindful and selective about where you want to go and what you want to do. Questions about that distinction? Okay. Assuming you get in someplace, and assuming you're, I'm still talking about doctoral programs here, you do your X number of years, and you're ready. And usually in doctoral clinical programs, the last year of study is an internship, which is basically a full-time clinical placement, usually someplace different from where you've been. You might have to move across the country or whatever you're going to do. And there's, in your third or fourth year, depending on which program you're in, you have match day. So you go and you interview at all these different internship placements, and then you rank order the ones that you want, and then they rank order their applicants, and then a computer determines your future, and you have a match, and hopefully you get an internship, and then you spend your last year doing clinical work full-time at that rotation, and then when you're done, congratulations, you're finished, assuming you've done your dissertation or your final year project. So the internship and match day is a very, very big deal in graduate school, because that's sort of like, you've done all this work leading up to this, and then it's sort of like, I want to go here, do they want me to? So that's, it's just like for residency with medical schools.
You might want to advance your slide.
Oh, yeah, sorry. That's
No
good.
problem.
That helps. Okay, thank you. So that's match day. The way that most licensing laws are set up throughout the country are that in order to get licensed as a psychologist, you have to do 1 year of full-time, you have to do 2 years of full-time clinical work. The first of those years is the internship year. The second of those years has to come post-degree, right? So after you graduated, after you finish your dissertation or your project, you graduated from wherever you graduate, you're Dr. So-and-so, you still need to do another year of clinical work before you can sit for the licensing exam. Many people choose to do that through what's called the postdoctoral fellowship, which is another year of, if you want to paint it harshly, indentured servitude, where you're doing a lot of work for not nearly enough money in exchange for a training experience. You have to have a licensed psychologist sign off on the hours that you provided, and then apply for licensing at the state board. They grant you the ability to sit for the license. Then you take the licensing exam. When you pass the licensing exam, congratulations, you're a licensed psychologist and you can practice independently. You can hang out your shingle, you can get on insurance boards, they'll reimburse you, they'll do all of that kind of stuff. But if you want to be a licensed psychologist, clinical counseling, whatever, you, in most states, have to get a doctoral degree, have to pass a licensing exam, which is going to involve the internship and some years of postdoctoral supervised research, or supervised clinical work. Okay. APA approved versus non-APA approved programs. I'm going to make this very simple. Do not attend a non-APA approved program. Do not go to a non-APA approved internship. It will hold you back. Most licensing boards and most state boards and all those kinds of things, they always want to know, did the program that you attend, was it approved by the American Psychological Association? It makes your life 1,000 times easier if you're able to just check the box that says yes. If you check the box that says no, you're going to get a letter back and they're going to say, we want X supporting documentation, blah, 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 blah. And you're going to have to sort of fight for your right to sit for the licensing board, even though it could be completely legitimate. You're going to have to convince them, because they all sort of accept the standard that if it's APA approved, then it passes muster. It just makes your life 1,000 times easier. So whatever graduate program you want to attend, whatever internship you want to do, it matters less with the postdoctoral fellowships. In fact, I don't even know if APA approves postdoctoral fellowships. Anyway, you want to attend APA approved programs, period. Okay, there's not much that's clear cut about graduate study in psychology. That's one of them. Okay, and then the licensing I pretty much talked about. So other ways in which you can pursue doing clinical work that don't involve getting a doctoral degree in psychology, and there are plenty. Okay, so if you, well, does everybody understand the difference between psychology and psychiatry? Right? What's the difference between psychology and psychiatry?
Prescribing medicine.
That's true, although that's changing, but that's a whole other panel discussion. Okay, the big difference is that psychiatrists go to medical school. Right, so they do 4 years, not as psychology majors, but basically pre-med. where they're taking a lot of bio and chem and all those sorts of things. They go to medical school, they go through 4 years of medical school, then they decide, oh, I really like psychiatry, so then they do a 3 or 4 year residency in psychiatry, okay? In psychology, you're going to grad school, you're not going to medical school. And when psychiatrists graduate, they have a medical degree, they can prescribe medication, it's basically a very biologically based treatment of mental illness. Psychology is much more psychotherapy oriented, talking as opposed to dispensing medication or prescribing medication, okay? You can do clinical work by being a psychiatrist, all right? You're still getting a doctoral degree, it's just in a very sort of different vein in a different area. Non-doctoral clinical degrees, okay, so these are things that you can do where you can provide clinical services without getting a doctoral degree. So, school psychology, many states, including Rhode Island, you get a master's degree in school psychology and provide clinical services to students in school districts, cognitive testing, learning assessments, therapy programs, that kind of stuff, with a master's degree, okay? Master's in social work, the MSW. The standard for doing clinical work in social work is different than it is in psychology. Most states will license someone, they become what's called a licensed clinical social worker. You get a master's degree, you do X number of clinical hours, and you can get licensed to do psychotherapy. You're not a psychologist, you're a licensed clinical social worker, but you're doing the same work, okay, with a master's degree. Marital and family therapists in many states often only require a master's degree in marital and family therapy. So if you want to do couples counseling, you want to do family therapy, you can become a licensed marriage and family therapist without getting a doctoral degree in psychology. Okay? You can get a master's in applied behavioral analysis. I think, does Sue Wondolowski have that? She's like, I don't think so.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think so. Sue Wondolowski is an adjunct professor here, I think has her master's in applied behavioral analysis, where you come up with behavioral plans, whether it's for kids or adults or whatever, and you are providing those services maybe in a clinic setting, so on and so forth. But you can do some of that work with that degree. Many states have what's called a licensed mental health counselor or clinician degree, where, again, that is at the master's level. So you go to I know Massachusetts has this degree, and there are several master's programs in Massachusetts where you go, and that program basically gives you all of the curriculum that you need and prepares you to sit for the licensing exam, and then after 2 years in passing the licensing, boom, you're a counselor. You can practice independently, okay? So there are lots of different options for how you can provide clinical services that do not involve getting a doctoral degree. They typically pay less, but when you calculate how much time you spend and how much money you spend getting a doctoral degree, sometimes the difference is not all that much, okay? And as Professor Moynihan Martin mentioned, the way insurance companies are going with healthcare, a lot of insurance companies actually prefer to pay a lesser credentialed professional because it costs them less money. And I know a lot of people who do work at a master's degree level, and they are phenomenal clinicians. I know a lot of them who are terrible, but I know a lot of doctoral level clinicians who are terrible. The degree isn't necessarily the determinant of that. It's who you are and the training that you have and what you put into it. There are other clinically related degrees that are not necessarily psychology, but an undergraduate degree in psychology would set you up very nicely for. So things like occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech pathology. We have a student who is about to graduate with as a PA, as a physician's assistant. She was an undergraduate in psychology, graduated from our program. We have another student who right now is applying for Psy.D programs in traditional university type settings. So there are lots of different speech pathology, physician assistant. Like I said, pretty much any area of work where you're working with people and providing services, an undergraduate degree in psychology is helpful because it's the study of behavioral and mental processes. So you kind of can't lose. It's a good basis for a lot of different areas and jumping off points in there.
We're a little bit tight on time, but what I'm hoping is if we can try to be done by 5:15, and of course if you have to go by 5, go ahead and excuse yourself, and all of this will be emailed to you, and we have this video as well that we'll post on your Facebook pages. Thank you. Yeah, and you might have to click to see who's next. It might be Professor, there we go.
Okay, I'm gonna go really quickly because Professor DeLuca brought of these great books. So deciding where to apply, and this is probably one of the questions that I get the most often when people come to see me, whether to apply and where. So this is your Bible. And I think this is probably the most comprehensive resource out there for psychology. This is because I believe this runs the gamut, and I'm not an expert with this book, but there's over 600 programs in here, and it will run the gamut of master's and PhD level programs. There's also some websites out there, but they're more general websites. And the other book. Do we have the Insiders? I guess not. The Insider's Guide to the Psychology Major will do something similar, but the Graduate Study in Psychology is the book that you probably want to grab. And there are some online resources. I don't know much about allpsychologyschools.com. It's something I found when I was just doing a Google search, so I'm not sure how comprehensive that is or not, but it might be worth a try. And the rest are sort of general that you probably are familiar with from researching undergraduate schools. Usually they take care of both sides. Talk to your faculty, I can't stress that enough. Most of the success stories that I hear from students in my office are students who have paired with a faculty member for that one-on-one advising experience. And there's no better resource at your disposal. Everybody here has gone through the process, so take advantage of that. And I can't stress enough contacting universities directly, as alluded to. In a lot of cases that's necessary, but even in your research process, don't take this lightly. That's been made clear. Do your research. Benchmark guess on how many programs did you apply to? What do you advise?
Each year I applied. The first year I was cocky and stupid and only applied to 5, and that's why I got rejected. The second year I applied to 15 or 20 and got waitlisted at a couple. And the third year I applied to the same amount and got an acceptance, and I think 2 acceptances and a wait list. So, geographically diversify, which we'll get into later.
Mm-hmm. Great. So, and I would say that you want to, if you did this as an undergrad, you apply the same strategy. If you're applying to competitive programs, definitely apply to REACH schools, safety schools, that type of thing. So apply the same strategy. What are some questions that you might want to think about? We talked about the accreditation process and the APA versus non-APA. We're all clear on that. Specialization areas within the program. So in my program, I had a master's in counseling, but within that, you could get the master in family therapy to go on to practice and be a therapist. You could get a school psychology. So be familiar with the specializations within the program. Many PhD programs may have those tracks as well. The location, I would argue that in many cases, state if you disagree, that location can be a determinant of where you end up finding work afterwards. Not necessarily, but it can be because of your internship experience and practical experiences that you may have. You're making those connections and contacts in that geographic location that can really help you find work in that geographic location. So it's not the final determinant, but it can be a factor. Obviously, the faculty expertise, it's been mentioned before, definitely get to know the faculty. If you have a particular area of research that you're interested in, you may want to match that with particular faculty teaching at a different institution. This is really different than undergraduate. Don't do this at the undergraduate level, but you do it particularly at the PhD level. If they're going to only accept 3 to 20 folks, you better well have networked your way and shown your specific interest and your specific link to that faculty in there, and that's almost critical. So you need to do your research and you need to figure that out. Fact ratio to students is important, or may be important, determinant to consider. The culture of the campus, the culture of the program. I believe there's a very different culture among different programs, among different similar PhD programs, similar master's programs. My program was a program that was a fairly large program and a diverse program, extremely diverse. In fact, there were many folks who had gone out and worked and come back and brought a lot of life experience to the program that may or may not be where we want to be. We want to be with a more traditional aged or more similar aged graduate school population. So think about those kinds of cultural aspects to the program. Obviously, opportunities for research, and we talked about matching your research interests, knowing what your research interests are, and matching those to the faculty. The reputation and ranking of the program can be very important. I always tell students across the board, apply to the best programs you can apply to, get into the best programs, go to the best programs you can go to. I do think in many cases it does make a difference later on, but it's not the be-all, end-all to your future. So, do pay attention to it. Also be careful that sometimes the overall reputation of the university is okay, but the graduate program within that university is fabulous. So don't judge the whole university, judge the specific graduate program that you're applying to. The reverse can be true as well. Where do graduates find employment? What percentage of students actually graduated from completed the program? I think those are interesting statistics to look at. At the end of the day, we all want to be working at some point, probably. So take a look at that, and those are things that the university should be able to share with you. And we'll talk about financial costs and scholarships in a bit.
Okay, so we know that we're throwing a lot of information out at you once. It's a little overwhelming here. And on top of it, it's just going to take a lot of work. It's in terms of applying to graduate school. It's going to be like another job you have or taking another class, especially if you're doing it now as an undergraduate. You may want to plan, if you decide to go to graduate school right after you graduate from here, prior to your senior year during the summer, presumably you'll have more time to do a lot of these investigations here. Depending, as it says here, when you apply. What else do we have here? Advancing this. What to do applying to grad school. Go to this website for lots of different career information, but they do have a link to applying to graduate school. And they have a ton of information there that you'll find very, very useful. As we already said, you get a copy of this book here. That's the 2013 edition. This is 2011. You don't have to get the most recent one. And if you can even share the cost with someone, I think you'll find that very useful here. We already mentioned that. It's a comprehensive description of all these programs here. As Joe said, APA accredited is the gold standard. Of course, those programs are much more difficult to get into. They have all kinds of information for each school, including the student application data, the admission requirements, financial aid program focus. You may want to visit their websites once you find a school that's of interest to you, and then actually visit the schools here. But just to give you an idea of what you may find in here, this is the profile for the University of Michigan, which is where Professor Heather Lacey went. And if you apply to their bio-psych program, they had 44 applicants and accepted 10. In the cognitive program, which I think Heather was in, she did her Ph.D. in that? I thought she did. They had 44 applicants and they accepted 6. And in their clinical Ph.D. program that Joe mentioned, they had 288 applicants and they accepted 4. The harsh reality is you're not going to get in, probably. I hate to be cruel, but it's something you need to know up front, that some of these programs are very, very competitive.
But we still like you all.
We still like you all, but this book will tell you that. They're not all that competitive. This is like the worst. But this book will tell you which ones are super competitive and which you have a chance to get in. Not to mention your SAT scores, GRE scores, the average profile of those students, their GPAs, undergraduates. Yes.
There's another thing that some of them list if you're looking at clinical, and that's the percentage of students that were matched on match day. And
Good one, yeah.
Very nice, yeah.
there are fewer internships than people going in there. So I really look at that number very carefully. It's in the front of the chart. I mean, it's really worth looking at. And that goes back to APA accredited, but even people at APA accredited schools aren't getting matched that day. That doesn't mean the end of the world, because there's still stuff after there, but that's a number I really look at very carefully.
Okay, thank you. What else do we have here? Please note all the deadlines that they have for completing the GRE and applying for financial assistance. And all of the schools are different. They all have different deadlines. I think they all do it the same, but they don't. It's not like undergraduate school by May 1st you should apply or you get accepted or what have you. I already talked about the University of Michigan here. As Amy said, consider the geographic location and need for flexibility. If you're from New England area, there's a natural propensity to apply for the schools in this area, and that's wonderful. But there are other wonderful places in the country. And as Amy said, you may end up being employed in those parts of the country that you may not even thought of before. If you have a significant other, such as a husband or wife, you may want to talk all of this through with them and their career goals. which gets, it's called the two-body problem, and it gets very complicated. In terms of how many schools to apply to, Amy already mentioned this. The answers to the questions that we've already presented to you will help provide some focus here, but you could look at this. And we already mentioned, like in undergraduate school, you may have like safety schools, maybe schools, and reach schools. Consider all those factors. You have to complete the GRE typically if it's needed for the program. There's a whole set of deadline dates for that when you need to apply. You may actually have to take the subject area within the psychology depending upon the program, another set of deadline dates for that, so keep that in mind. What else you need to do is get to know your undergraduate psych faculty. Particularly if you're a senior now, well that, of course, left the barn because you're about to graduate. But during your 4 years here, you need to develop a relationship with the faculty here in any graduate program or in the area that you're interested in. For no other reasons, for a letter of recommendation. And I do have some hints here that in a handout, which I won't go over right now in the interest of time, that you can pick up. But just a few things here. You should be reasonably well acquainted with the faculty member. You should have had several classes with this person. You should have had, I would think, enjoyed conversations outside the classroom, wherever they might be. So we can get to know each other on a personal basis for the simple reasons we have something to write about. We need something to sink our teeth into so we can say something that's knowledgeable and useful to you. Another thing is to follow up the request after you send in the your application. We want to know what happened. I have to say sometimes I'm disappointed. I found out even recently through a third party that someone got into graduate school, they got an assistantship, and they never told me. It kind of bothered me.
I'd say that's like half the time.
Yeah.
Half and half. Sometimes I find
Yeah,
out.
it perplexes me and it bothers me, particularly in the one instance I went way out of my way on a real strict deadline, and the person was in another part of the country. We had a fax back and forth, and I came in during Christmas when they didn't want to, and I did all this, and they got everything, and never heard a thing.
And you never know when you're going to need Professor DeLuca's help in the future, so
Yeah.
stay in touch.
And this seems common sense. You may want to thank us after the fact, just after we write the just a little thanks. A little thanks. That'd be helpful. And also, this is a little nuance, but this has happened too. I sit down with the student, they want to go to graduate school, I write the letter, send the letter in, then I find out they didn't even apply.
Yeah.
They got a job and they changed their mind. And the only thing that shows up at the target school is my letter, which, in our opinion, is our waste of our time. So you're not committed to going to graduate school, might be asked for a letter of recommendation, but you're committed to applying, I think, if you go that far. So, am I sounding a little whiny today?
Amy, can I ask something? Do we have a place for a student to put it on file? Let's say,
I know what you're talking
Yeah.
about. Yeah, no, those have kind of come and gone by the
Yeah.
wayside. Yeah, there used to be those placement files in the
yeah,
old days of career centers. Now there was a movement to have students self-manage all of that. So
the only advantage is that if somebody's 5 years out,
it is.
it would be fresher.
It is. Yeah.
Okay, so moving ahead here, I think the bottom line with this particular slide is develop a relationship with the faculty while you're here. So we have something to write about, just because it's fun. Get to know each other, makes it fun. What else do we have here? Since they're the ideal students, seen through the eyes of the graduate faculty, we already covered this here, but they seem to be gifted and created. They're perfectly suited for this program, but you have to make that case. The ideal student is eager to pursue a line of inquiry that's valued by the faculty member, because you have this mentoring relationship with the faculty member. The ideal student is pleasant, responsible, and they don't want to deal with all your personal issues. As you'll see, are the kisses of death. If you apply to graduate school and say, I'm a little dysfunctional, essentially, I think a Ph.D. program will help me understand myself, that's a little far out, but go anywhere near that, they're going to kick
Even
you
in
out.
psych, in psych, people
Yeah.
would say, like, I'm attracted to psychology because I have
Because I'm screwed up.
a very long list of.
Or my whole family's screwed up, and I'm trying to understand them.
You'd be
Don't.
surprised how many applications
A lot.
say, like, I have a history of problems with depression, and my therapist really helped me. Okay, well, you're not getting that.
David for another day.
Yeah, not the place for this. What else do we have here? You need to distinguish yourself and tell your story in vibrant colors, while creatively connecting your graduate program with your postgraduate goals. And why graduate school makes sense to you at this point in your life. This is based on a Wall Street Journal article, actually applying to MBA programs that came out just last week. And why this school is the best pick? I want to go to the University of Michigan, even though it's competitive, because the cognitive psych program is exactly what I do, and they have these 2 faculty members who are interested in areas that I'm interested in.
Could I just add to that? So this is in your essay. So people
Yeah.
like look at this application, oh, I have to answer these 4 questions, it's no biggie. Answering those 4 questions is a biggie, a really biggie, where you want to accomplish all those things that Professor DeLuca said.
Yeah. And then I have another handout here. Again, you can read this on your own. Most of this is common sense, but avoiding the kisses of death in the application process. And they just, they have suggestions or illustrations, I should say, of errors that students make in their essays and so forth, like spelling errors. Duh, come on. You just can't do that in this.
Or I'm thrilled to go to the University of Michigan, but that goes to UPenn.
Oh, yeah, talk about kiss of death, yeah, exactly. Because you didn't bother to change, the name of the school here. So, I just want to thank BPA, actually all of us, for the invitation, and I'll pass it on to whoever's next. And that would be
Yeah,
GRE.
we kind of alluded to the GRE here, just some quick facts about the GRE. To register, gre.org, and there's tons more information on the GRE.
And we'll email this
Yeah,
out.
exactly, so you guys have that. There is a subject test, sometimes that's required, sometimes it's not. Find out if you need to take it. Does anyone say anything more about that?
The subject test in psych used to be required if you were applying your psych program. It's not as much anymore. The difference between the subject test and the regular GRE is that the regular GRE is an aptitude test. The subject test is an achievement test. So the regular GRE is just like the SAT. It's designed to test how well they think you're capable of performing well in graduate school. The subject test in psychology is designed to test how much you know about psychology. Okay, so it's sort of like a final comprehensive exam based on your coursework and all this stuff. And there are practice books for for the subject test. I highly recommend, if you're going to take it, get the practice book, read the practice books. The best way to study for the subject test in psychology, the GRE, is to get a very good, high-level introduction to psychology text, and make sure you know everything in that book, and take a bunch of practice tests, and you'll do fine.
And one other word about the GRE in general, I made it a practice of advising students to take it if you think about going to graduate school, because it's good for 5 years. But if you are thinking about graduate school, keep in mind, again, go back to the whole lesson about what kind of a graduate program, because this came up in Professor Mohan Martin's class, where students had taken the GREs and they discovered that many of the programs that they were interested in applying to didn't even require them. So it can be hard and demoralizing to take the GREs, particularly if you're not an avid test taker. So just do your research ahead of time, maybe before you spend the money to take the GRE and spend the time studying and investing in that.
And I just want to add that even though the GRE, most of it, non-subject, is an aptitude test, you can and should prepare for it quite extensively.
Absolutely.
And there's a lot of research to support that even though it is supposed to be an aptitude test, that prep does correlate with your ultimate score. And most of these books, the best part of the book, in my opinion, is the DVD or the access to take practice tests online. The more practice tests that you can get in with your score, and I also tell students, know those high-frequency vocab words, like go back SAT style and learn those words.
Am I right that you said that all scores will go to the
All
schools now,
all
but yes,
scores will be viewed by the graduate program unless right after you take the GRE, you have a chance to void those scores without seeing what you scored. So if you just feel like this pit of your stomach, like I did awful, I don't even want to see what I did, you have a chance to take it and then literally erase everything you did by saying, I don't want to post the score. And you'll never know what your score was. But that's the only way you have. Otherwise, if the score gets posted and you find out what the score is, that does get released and visible to everyone.
I just grabbed that
Yep.
clicker. I think just to honor and respect our time frame here, and you guys were nice to stay a little bit
Absolutely.
extra, we appreciate that. I don't even think we're gonna say too much here about the financing. This will all come around to, there are ways to pay for it. Having said that, a number of us are still paying off the loans and will be till we're 50, but it's okay. The goal is to get them done in time for the kids to need college loans, right? I'll get there. And then the end, except, is this just the beginning? I don't know. I hope it will be for you. And yeah, so I just want to thank you. I hope the goal was to whet your appetite. I know it's a little bit overwhelming, but a lot of really great grad school options, and we are here and love having these conversations with you one-on-one. So thanks for coming.
There's one more thing I want to say. If you're interested in pursuing a doctoral degree, and you know that you're probably not going to be able to get in coming from here, and just the sheer statistics of it, there are master's programs throughout the country that are geared specifically towards preparing you for admission to a clinical Ph.D. program that have very, very high success rates, like upwards of 90%. In other words, like if you come to this program and you do well after 2 years and you apply to some of the top ranked, fully funded clinical Ph.D. programs, you've got a 95% chance of getting in. Do not ignore those programs because they can be very, very helpful. A lot of people end up just going to a professional school for 5 years and they end up paying, $100,000. Maybe you can invest $50,000 in a 2-year master's degree that gets you a fully funded doctoral program. So that's the only thing I want to mention.
And Joe has a great contact at one of those schools.
I have, yes, I do.
At least one.
As a matter of fact, yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Don't forget about the handouts
Yep.
Grab this hand. Signed in.